Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for signing up, and thank you so much for showing up, especially those who arrived early and promptly. Much appreciated. My name is Clarissa. I'm from ERC, or the Environmental Reporting Collective, and I am joined by Chantal and Baoying, who are both from ERC, as well as Nicole and Gerry, who worked with us on our last project. It was a global project. So for those who aren't aware, Environmental Reporting Collective is a collective of environmental investigative journalists. We're based in the Global South primarily, so Southeast Asia. But we do have reporters all across the world. And for our latest project, we tried to do one global one every year. This one was on data centers. During our first study session group, we spoke with two reporters who broke the story of data centers, mainly from Google in India, that ended up taking up a lot of Dalit lands. And that story actually got banned in India. Today, we are joined by Gerry and Nicole, who reported from Bangkok and Singapore. So Gerry and Nicole, if you could both introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about the story that you worked on.
Thank you very much, Clarissa. Thank you. Yes, I'm Gerry Flynn. I'm a journalist working for Mongabay. So we're covering environmental issues, and the scope of my work is kind of focused on the Mekong region. So looking into data centers with the ERC was kind of a first for me, as it's not really something that I was particularly familiar with, but globally we could see that there's just a wide range of issues, environmental issues associated with data centers, particularly AI data centers and sort of hyperscalers that support the AI boom that's happening at the moment. So a lot of what we were looking at in Thailand was quite difficult to really pin down, partly because the vast majority of the coverage of data center development in Thailand prior to, I think the ERC's project had been focused mostly on just how much money it was bringing in. There was not really any scrutiny or any concern about the environmental impacts, despite the fact that the vast majority of the 70 data centers that we identified were being built in an area that was already hit quite heavily by water shortages and droughts annually. And these are also heavily agricultural areas. So, a lot of fishers and farmers were basically paying the price as new data centers come online. The water resources are becoming more scarce. Simultaneously, we found that a lot of the data centers that are being built, while some of them are definitely going to be using the few renewable energy sources that Thailand has to offer, that doesn't seem to be the case for the majority. So this continued expansion, which doesn't seem to be particularly planned in Thailand, kind of risks locking the country further into fossil fuels and exacerbating climate change, which, particularly in Bangkok, we're feeling very acutely the air pollution. So yeah, it was quite a multifaceted investigation that we were able to do with the ERC, and we've actually got a little follow-up in the pipeline now. So yeah, stay tuned for that. I'll hand it over to Nicole.
Thank you, Gerry. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole. I'm an independent journalist. I'm now based in Lisbon, but I am from Singapore. And before I moved, I had been covering Singapore and Southeast Asia for a long time, specifically looking at like business and market-related news. So data centers is an industry that I covered for a while from the business side of things. And when I became an independent journalist, I reached out to Kontinentalist to work with them on some stories. And this opportunity came up. They were doing an investigative piece on data centers in the region, which I happen to have covered quite a bit. So my story is about the data center expansion across 3 jurisdictions in Southeast Asia, namely Singapore, Johor, and Batam, in which it's a growth triangle that Singapore pitched many, many years ago to investors to set up manufacturing industries and like textiles and all these industries to support Singapore's growth. And so what the story was about was really how Singapore, which is this giant in tech, finance, medicine, all these booming industries, is offloading a lot of their back-end work to neighboring countries and using that as a pitch to say, we are one big collective, we're one big triangle that the world can invest in. And it's tricky because I think the amount of investments that were coming into Singapore, as well as Johor and Batam, was something that the infrastructure and environment of Johor and Batam couldn't handle. I think Singapore, the government is a lot more, has a bit of, is a bit more picky and has a bit of, can I say, like they have a bit of foresight in planning for how such a boom of data centers would impact our environment. So when it came to Johor and Batam, I think it was quite a immediate boom that the government in these countries couldn't handle at the time. So we saw a lot of waste that was running into rivers, similar to what Gerry said. I think the soil was eroding, trees were being cut down, a lot of environmental damage was happening. And so the piece really just was a focus around how Singapore is trying to project this pristine image of like this growth triangle, investors can come in to look at this space and invest and build more data centers. But at the same time, there was a lot of environmental damage that was happening in both Johor and Batam, and the growth was just too much to manage. So I worked with the team at Kontinentalist, which is a data journalism publication in Singapore. And they did an amazing job. If you read the story, there are a lot of visuals on compounding just the data around like the growth of data centers. I think they did a really amazing job with the visuals, and most of what I did was just the reporting and cobbling the story together. So I'll pass back the time to the guys at ERC.
Thank you so much for covering it. As a Malaysian, I feel it in my heart. Yes. When working on the story, this is for the both of you. What did you find on the ground that you did not expect? Or was it everything according to expectations?
I don't really know what I expected, to be honest. But I think probably one of the most surprising things from Thailand that we found was how few people even really understood what a data center was or what the impact might be. Clearly it is a very sort of nascent development. I think in 2024 in Thailand there was a handful of data centers being developed, whereas in 2025 that sort of jumped. I think there's like $23 billion worth of investment over the course of last year, and then already this year I think we've already seen about another 30 or so billion. Don't quote me on that exact figure, but there's been a substantial investment again this year, and we're only 7 months in. So hopefully that will kind of translate to a little bit more awareness on the ground. But I think the complete lack of explanation or engagement from the developers of data centers or from the regulators who are kind of approving these projects was quite surprising. Even local officials were telling us that if there had been an environmental impact assessment for this project, these officials would have been the people to have seen it. And they were saying, well, we just haven't seen anything like this. There was a lot of disappointment that was also quite surprising in terms of jobs, because obviously, I think globally one of the big kind of letdowns on the data center front is it promises a lot of jobs, but often the majority of those jobs tend to be in the construction of the data center rather than the operation. And in the case of Thailand, that task fell predominantly to migrant workers. So a lot of these workers are Burmese, that were being brought in. So even people who didn't necessarily expect to get a job once the data center opened found that there actually weren't any opportunities provided by that project and during the construction phase either. So overall, I think it was surprising to see how many people were in the dark. I mean, one Chinese data center that was opening in Rayong province on the coast of Thailand, they didn't actually, apparently, according to the local officials we spoke to, they didn't even get building permission. They just kind of showed up one day and began construction. And so, of course, local residents saw a contingent of Chinese nationals building a, obscure structure in a abandoned lot and assumed it was a scam compound or something, linked to online fraud, because they just had no clue, no communication or engagement. And obviously, a lot of the data center developers are not particularly transparent with their operations. So, yeah, I think that was probably for me what was most surprising. I think, especially when you compare how much resistance is sort of being is building against AI data centers in many other parts of the world, whereas Thailand, I think, is maybe a little bit behind in that respect for now, at least.
Just a lack of transparency and communication and even awareness, it seems, by the officials who are supposed to be aware. What about you, Nicole?
Yeah, I think I want my point was to echo what Gerry just said. I think it's really interesting, particularly now, to see that, the rest of the world, especially in the US, there's a lot of citizen backlash against data center builds. But while I was doing this story and also covering the region for a couple of years, you don't really hear so much about citizens protesting. And in my story, I specifically highlighted this case of a protest that was held outside one of Johor's construction sites. And I think because it happened in February, the piece came out in May, so we were tracking what was happening from when the protest started all the way until it ended. And I think what happened was the protesters gathered around the construction site for a day and then were swiftly sort of like ushered away by the police. And then I think they tried to engage authorities on some of the concerns they had around the environmental issues that they were facing, such as like noise pollution, air pollution, stuff like this. But I think in the end, the case sort of just, I don't know what happened to it. It just like stopped becoming a case. And I heard from a journalist in Malaysia as well that I think they had settled with the residents. I don't know if it was the regulators who settled with the residents or the regulators and the data center owners that settled with the residents. But basically, it didn't blow up into something more, which is, I guess, not something that you would see in other parts of the world. So that was interesting to observe, particularly also because, yeah, I think Johor is a state that has faced years of environmental stresses from all the manufacturing that has happened there, all the logging, stuff like that. So I thought that was really interesting. What was interesting to me also, which is not surprising, was just the fact that we had to crunch the figures of how much electricity, water, resources data centers use. And if you see our piece, there's one part where we list it out in a infographic how much power and water is needed for the different types of data centers annually. And just looking at the scale of it was really, really shocking for me. I was like, wow, I didn't expect, so much resources. And we compared it against how that would look like against a household, right, in Singapore. Yeah, so the scale was really shocking. And I think just the last thing is, like speaking with industry experts, data center operators, some government-related officials in Malaysia, Singapore, not so much Batam, which is still a bit of a nascent industry compared to the other two. You realize that, yeah, there's a lot of positivity around how they talk about investments, developments, what is happening, what outcome it would bring for the economy. Yeah, I think there's a lot of like positivity around that, even for Singapore independent observers who know that a moratorium was placed in Singapore because it was draining our resources. There was still that bit of like, yeah, but if we expand data centers to beyond our backyards, then it would it would positively impact Malaysia and Batam as well, right? So it was just painted as this very like rosy picture, which was interesting to observe. So yeah.
Yeah, that's almost a tale as old as time, unfortunately. So Singapore, as you mentioned and reported on, initially paused the data center expansion, and that problem moved next door. Now Singapore has lifted the moratorium, but with stricter criteria. However, what does this tell us or told you about the how the region is managing this data center expansion?
Yeah, I think it can be safe to say that Singapore has been looked up to by some of the surrounding countries, and in the reporting as well. I think it's been said that we set certain standards for how environmental practices should be, but I think it's very much like we've already sort of done the damage. We've had a long history of building data centers in Singapore. Well or not, it's up for debate, but I think what we've really done here is, impose a bunch of very strict regulations around data center builds, which is very typical of Singapore, right? It's a bunch of like regulations, and then you're supposed to adhere to it. And industry observers have said that, this is good for countries in the region who are looking to grow their data center industries as well. But I think the difficulty there is that Singapore has had, years of thinking about sources of renewable energy. We've had years experimenting with like data centers, but for states like Johor that just started to have data centers come online, I don't know how they will simultaneously implement such strict measures while witnessing the build of data centers, which is happening really quickly, right? I think in our reporting we found that some of the data centers would come online in like 9 months, right? And so some of these regulations like don't even come online that quickly. And so once it's being built, like how do you? I think one thing is it's moving in silos quite quickly, and I don't feel really confident that what is happening now could be beneficial for the environment or helpful. Um, yeah, I don't know. I'm not too familiar with how the regulations in Singapore extend to other parts of Southeast Asia. Yeah, maybe Gerry could take over.
Yeah, I mean, I think from what we've seen in Thailand, it has been very rapid growth, and certainly regulation has failed to keep pace. Earlier this year, we saw the Ministry of Energy kind of musing with the idea of charging data centers or data center operators a surplus on electricity, and then reinvesting that extra money either into the expansion of renewable energy infrastructure, or using it to subsidize households' electricity bills, because there's the assumption that with more data centers comes more power plants. With more power plants comes more feed-in tariffs, which effectively ensure that the operators of these power utilities get paid by the government. So as a result, energy bills typically have to rise for average people to be able to cover those costs. But so far, none of that has really translated into policy, which is kind of what my follow-up story is going to be looking at. Because I think increasingly now that more data centers are coming online, the problems associated with them are going to start making themselves much more apparent. Whereas I think when we began looking at this with the ERC back in November or so, I think it was our first reporting trip on the ground, not many of the data centers that we were looking at had actually come online. Most were kind of in the construction phase or were planned, but hadn't really progressed beyond just plot of land somewhere. So I think now the timeline, because you're right, I think the data centers do come online incredibly quickly compared to a lot of other infrastructure of that kind of size, or infrastructure that would demand that volume of resources. A lot of them are more or less like prefab concrete buildings, more or less like a warehouse to keep a bunch of servers in with water pipes and possibly some generators. But so it's not a lot. Although the Amazon data centers that we did see in Thailand had sort of like a military style blockades in front of the driveway and like a camera on top of every fence post surrounding it. They were pretty heavily fortified for essentially a data center. But no, I think there will be a reckoning in terms of the need for regulation, particularly on water. I think water in Thailand is probably going to be the key resource. I think Thailand has about a surplus energy supply of like 40%. I think out of the sort of 55,000 megawatts that it produces every year, only about 36 or 37,000 megawatts, 36 or 37,000 megawatts, sorry, are actually used. So there's enough electricity to handle the growth, but whether or not there is enough water, or if there's even enough connectivity within the national grid to get that electricity to where it needs to go, those could be big issues. So I think, yeah, hopefully we'll see some movement on that in the coming months, but it depends, because one of the largest companies involved in the construction of data centers, the supply of renewable energy, and the supply of water to data centers is a company that was founded by the current Prime Minister's father, and where the current Prime Minister's brother sits on the board of directors. So I'm not saying that's why the regulations are so loose, but it might be a factor. I don't know.
Yeah, there's that the myth of the trickle down high standards that's being propagated. But I suppose if those standards don't include the standards of what companies that we're willing to work with, and whether their construction standards meets ours, then it doesn't really have any, I don't see how it would have any effect on neighboring countries. So thank you both. And Gerry, thank you for going through the next couple of questions. I'd like you both to expand on them as well. Just going back to that electricity demand from data centers, because our story from Taiwan also covered grid pressure. Can you paint a picture? What does this mean for ordinary people in their day-to-day lives? You brought up higher tariffs, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other, besides just sort of the potential to raise electricity bills, and I mean, Thailand's energy bills are standardized. So nationally, or certainly within metropolitan and provincial areas, they're standardized. So it would only affect prices if more power generation utilities are developed, in which case, and they actually, if they create power purchase agreements with the government. What we're seeing from the Thai Board of Investment is plans to allow data center developers to develop direct power purchase agreements with power utilities, which is interesting because we've already seen that one of Gulf Energy, one of the largest power conglomerates or energy conglomerates in Thailand, not only owns a huge amount of energy infrastructure, but they're also now building data centers. So there's likely going to be a case where they would be able to buy energy from themselves to supply their data center, which I'm not entirely sure if or how that could be abused, but I'm sure that these sort of the fact that one company is owning so much of this digital infrastructure and energy infrastructure is probably quite alarming. But besides that, I mean, I think one major issue is, without massive investment, presumably from the government, in renewable energy infrastructure in Thailand, then it's going to ensure that Thailand is more reliant on fossil fuels, which we know are fueling the climate crisis. And already we're seeing not just in parts of Thailand where data centers are being built, but like across the country, really. There are increasing droughts, particularly in like the rice bowl provinces. So, agricultural outputs are already being pretty badly affected by rising temperatures, by changing rainfall patterns. And so if Thailand continues to rely on fossil fuels, which I think currently make up about between 75 and 80% of Thailand's energy mix. There's a very small, very limited availability of renewable energy in Thailand. Then it is going to be contributing to a crisis that could affect its food security. Certainly will affect many of the poorest Thais who are reliant on agriculture or natural resources. So I think without more planning on that front, there could be a crisis of its own making somewhere down the line. But kind of have to wait and see a little bit, which is not a great strategy, I don't think.
Yeah, I think similar to Gerry, I think for Singapore specifically, yeah, I can say that, the government, when they imposed the moratorium on data center builds in 2019, I think they were quite forthcoming with saying that, it's putting a lot of pressure on our electricity bills. I think it accounted for like 7% of the country's electricity at that point of time, which is, and it was, I think, like still half of what we had in terms of like data center capacity compared to now, or what we're planning at least. So I think that was a wake-up call for the Singapore government. And I guess the story is then when Singapore turned away these investors, they went to neighboring countries, which Singapore pitched to them as well. And I think Johor was really excited to have some of these data center operators rush in. They call it like the data center gold rush, right? And I think they were really relaxed with some of the criteria they had around like water usage, electricity usage. And we know for a fact that some of these data centers, when they apply for permits to buy land and like to use electricity, they often overestimate how much they need. And so when they send in these applications to state power plants and operators, and it's approved, say they ask for like 100% of electricity, sometimes they only use 50% of it, and the rest of the electricity cannot be channeled elsewhere, and so all of that is wasted. So I think Johor's government has started to implement stricter rules around how, like penalties, basically, if you are a data center and you apply for this amount of electricity, if you don't end up using all of it, there are certain penalties per kilowatt of shortfall, as well as water usage. But I think, unfortunately, like what Gerry said, like all these impacts of electricity wastage and water related wastage will only come into fruition a little bit later, partly also because I think data centers are built in places that not many people stay in, right? So in Singapore, it's really very out of sight, out of mind. In Johor, I think there's still areas that are quite residential. That's why there was the big protest that happened in February. But Johor also notoriously has mining industries around the area that have suffered from accidents. I think there were mining accidents that happened that ended up polluting water sources in Johor, which I think we might see more and more of if construction regulations are imposed more heavily on data center builds, which is also something that we're seeing. I think one analyst who had been working on the data center industry for a long time told me that it's a very, like the regulations are in constant negotiation. There is no like one standard that they should be following in Malaysia specifically. And so sometimes the operators come in and do as they please, and then the government is like, okay, like sorry, like you have to do it this way instead. And then they sort of like go around doing it another way. And so it's not very tightly regulated, is what I'm trying to say. And so I think because of that, there could be a scenario in which, yeah, like more water pollution cases might happen in Johor. And yeah, Malaysia is also like a fossil fuel dependent country. It's a state, it's an energy producing state as well. So I don't know how that might turn out. And famously, right, like Southeast Asia is already a region that is experiencing like big climate problems. I think that the weathers in Johor, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia is getting like really, really out of control. It's really, really hot. So I think, yeah, it will be slow, but I think the impact of the data centers on the everyday person will come into fruition at some point. Yeah.
Yeah, not really looking forward to the blackouts, if there are any, knock on wood. And the residential areas, they're very clever about what kind of residents they do evict as well, right? Like in the more informal residents, I think in Batam, there were a lot of Orang Bajau communities who were displaced, Dalit lands in India. So really just knowing who to pick on seems partially strategic. So just among the arguments for hyperscale data centers, as there have been quite a few, just saying that they do not consume that much energy, as the critics are claiming. Most of them utilize recycled water. They provide these jobs. Your investigations have, like, what have they found in response to those allegations?
Yeah, it's really hard to scrutinize these claims that data centers don't use as much water as they've been sort of publicly accused of, or that their electricity demand is actually sustainable. Largely because the data center operators just don't disclose this. There's very, very few companies that will actively put out a public record saying how much water their data center is going to consume, or where its energy is sourced, or an overlooked component of the data centers is how the wastewater is managed, because often the wastewater that does come out, because as much as you can have a closed loop system for water management, you still have evaporative loss. You still have water that needs to be discharged, and often that involves in the coolant, the coolant fluid. You've seen some data centers are using PFAS, like the forever chemicals. Others are using things like chlorine or other sort of like anti-scaling agents to prevent the cooling system from rusting. And so obviously when all of this gets poured back out into a natural waterway, which appears to be the case in at least one or two data centers in Thailand, there's a huge risk to aquatic life, to farmers or fishers who might use that water either for irrigation or for fishing or aquaculture. But what we did find with one data center, that the data center operator themselves, Bridge Data Centers from, I believe from Singapore, that company did not disclose how much water was going to be used by the data center, but the water utility that was providing it put out a press statement saying like, hey, we've got our first data center client, and they're going to need 9,000 cubic meters of water every day, which is a lot. I think it was when we found a study online from, I think, 2024 that had kind of measured the water usage of people in the province that this data center is being built in. And it basically, I think it worked out to around the daily water consumption of about 37,000 people, which is quite insane. But then it somehow got worse in that we found, when we went to the site and spoke to the subcontractors who were building the water pipes, they said, oh, no, it's not 9,000 cubic meters. They're going to need 12,000 cubic meters a day. which is closer to like the water usage of about 49,000 people. So it's the equivalent of sort of a large scale power plant, basically. It's pretty nuts level of water. And if you think, okay, we've got, I think now in Thailand, about 75 or 76 data centers in various stages, either operational, planned, or under construction. About 40 of them, I think, are under construction or planned. And about 2/3 of those are all going into the Eastern Economic Corridor, which is a special economic zone that consists of now 4 provinces in Thailand: Chachoengsao, Chonburi, Rayong, and Prachinburi. But all of these provinces are heavily water stressed. A lot of them, despite the last sort of decade of industrialization, a lot of them still have a heavy reliance on agriculture. So, we're going to see a disproportionate impact on these provinces' poorest residents, mostly, when data centers do start effectively getting first dibs on what water resources are available. So it's pretty alarming to see just how much water one data center is going to consume, and then kind of multiply that by the factor of potentially 40 odd. So yeah, I think there should be really more transparency on this, because at the moment it's basically without kind of just getting lucky and finding a little scrap of information tucked away somewhere in the internet. It's not really possible to get an idea of just how much water is going to be needed. And we even asked government agencies in charge of regulating water, and none of them, despite the fact there's about 4 in Thailand that linked to water management, none of them could tell us how much water the current crop of data centers would actually require. So it's, yeah, a bit of a mystery, unfortunately. We'll have to keep pushing on that one.
Yeah, I think Gerry said most of it. There's a lot of greenwashing that has been, I guess, like done around data centers. And while I was still working in Singapore, I remember I was with a business paper and we had done a story about like green data centers, because we had noticed that all these data centers in Singapore were coming up with like sustainability reports when they said like we use 100% renewable energy, just a lot of like greenwashing terms. And I had really gone down to, speak to these operators who were willing to speak with me about like what that meant, what are some of the initiatives that they have been using to manage like electricity use, water use, like innovative technologies. And yeah, I think a lot of it was extremely fluffy, and their reporting had no sort of like guidelines to follow, right? I don't think it was necessarily like mandated guidelines for reporting. So yeah, I think a lot of it just read as fluff. I will say in covering Singapore as a center, as a hub of like technology and innovation, that there have been pretty innovative cooling technologies that have been implemented or are trying to be implemented. But yeah, I think just the rate in which like data centers are coming online and what they're being used for at the moment, like social media things, like AI workloads, and I don't think the technology the speed at which the data centers are coming online will be able to adopt these technologies that are still like budding, and it costs a lot of money. So I think operators and governments are most inclined to do things that, serve them the quickest and the lowest cost for operators. For governments, I think they want projects that can come in quickly and that can fuel the economy, right? So I think the reality is that if it's a win-win situation for both the government and the hyperscalers, then there's not going to be a lot of incentive for them to quickly adopt more environmentally friendly solutions. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you both for your very comprehensive answers. I think that really covers it. With the math doesn't math if if your core motive is to make profit. Those technologies will be very helpful, but whether the incentives are there to implement them is another question. Just to go on to a more personal level, what did it feel like for you to report in communities that weren't being consulted or weren't aware of what's being built near them, and asking these questions and talking to them about given what you know?
Yeah. I mean, having reported in Cambodia, I'm kind of quite used to being the bearer of bad news and, often being the first person to kind of inform some of the communities of what's happening in their areas. But in this case, yeah, it was particularly bleak to see the mismatch between the promise of the investment. I think when residents heard, oh, Google is coming to town or TikTok is going to build a data center and they've got this much money, and then actually there doesn't really seem to be a lot of material benefits at all for the communities nearby. I mean, there has been a lot of talk, particularly among sort of like the global north big tech companies, saying that they're going to invest X amount into education programs or upskilling programs, so that there'll be more opportunity for domestic labor forces to work at these data centers, beyond just a construction capacity. It's kind of hard to say exactly how effective or even needed a lot of that is, when at the end of the day, we spoke to some fishermen who said, like, well, they're too old. They said they were too old to be able to get a job working as security, and that's about the only job that they'd be able to do. But the data centers that were going in to that particular province were likely going to impact the waterways that they fish on, and they're also buying up a lot of land, which just means that for a lot of communities who don't have access to land titles or land tenure, there was quite a sense of frustration, that as Thai nationals and residents of their community for generations, they'd not been able to secure things like a land title, piped tap water, secure electricity, while these sort of big multi-billion-dollar conglomerates can just swoop in, buy up a whole swath of land, and get sweetheart deals on tax, everything else. It just seemed like a bit of a weird juxtaposition to a lot of people. Quite unfair, frankly. I think that was the overall sentiment.
Yeah, I think for me, I felt like I will say, obviously, I think the reporting on data centers is important, but I think having covered the space for a while also, I don't really know how much we can impact change. I think that's just me being very honest. Yeah, because it is very much a business deal between governments and operators, and there's a lot of money involved. Very little incentive to, I guess, like help citizens on the ground. Which, I mean, it's always like, yeah, it's tricky, right? Then you shouldn't stop reporting on these things. But yeah, this is to say, I think very little progress has been made. I think over the last couple of years, it only feels like the scale of things have gotten worse simply because AI is now this like giant, right? And people are like, I think generally people in Singapore, and could I say maybe like broader Southeast Asia, are quite open to the idea of AI. So yeah, I think like and obviously like the back end of AI is used, it's data centers. infrastructure supporting these developments, right? So I don't know, I think I feel when doing this story sad, but also sad, and also like I'm not sure how to make things better. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like it's being forced upon you, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
Even Google, Gmail, a lot of automated opt-out options, or not even the option to opt out, can feel very frustrating and helpless. So we're going to leave the next 15 minutes for audience questions. I know that Sakshi and Rudra have really politely asked their questions in the chat. So if you don't mind just repeating your questions again, Rudra and then Sakshi in that order, and whoever else can raise their hand. Okay. All right. Sorry, Sakshi's mic is not on. Rudra, do you mind asking your question first, or would you like me to ask it for you?
Yeah.
Okay.
The here is one big issue is that let me put you on very small information, like recently government has taxed on electricity use. Though there is some surplus energy, electricity, clean electricity, and many reporters wrote the report that the electricity taxation was against common citizens. They have to use more electricity for that. That's an indicator of the, let's say, progress and economic prosperity. And it's like that in hindsight, I have been looking with this data, why they were doing that, because they have announced a set of plans to bring in data centers, and some news are coming that Google and Meta is coming because they have two incentives over here, because the weather is very cool, Himalayan weather, it's cool weather, and they may have to worry less for the cooling. I think, I don't know, you know that you have been doing a lot of reporting on it, you know that. I don't know about that. I'm just curious to know that whether that makes sense or not. And the next is that many hydropower projects who want to build more hydropower projects and generate more electricity, and they are, I think the government is taxing electricity for the general consumers, and now they are allotting more electricity for the let's say these data centers. And a couple of data centers are coming in operation, though they are in a small scale, let's say tier 4. They may go up to 5 megawatt. That's let's say, in terms of let's say dollar terms, let's say about $20 million project they have announced in Seoul. I don't know whether that is a big scale in comparison to the Singapore and Thailand, as Gerry and Nicole mentioned. But it seems that there is something big coming up, and no one has spoken about whether how Meta and Google is doing or thinking about this. I'm curious to know. The more thing is that how much water does the tier for data center uses water in water scale, because Kathmandu is already facing severe water shortage. These are my thoughts, and I would be very happy to get any ideas, and I'm interested to work on. I'm doing research for a story. If anyone would suggest me a better outlet for covering this, I'm interested. And there is a narrative, like someone was saying that Sakshi has also put some insights on it, and it's like a manufacturing consent. Everyone is in the town is talking about data centers as if that I'm the only one who doesn't know about it. Thanks.
So if I follow the question correctly, you wanted to know about whether or not the cooler weather would be a factor, and then regarding the water supply and potential for hydropower build-outs to being aiming to support data center growth in Nepal. I think on the cooler weather front, definitely that would be an attractive element. I know it was one of the big concerns for a lot of investors in Thailand, because over the dry season in Thailand, the temperatures reach kind of, on average, it can be over 40 degrees Celsius during the day. So this means that the cooling system has to work harder. I think it basically means you need a more advanced cooling system, and you need a more stable supply of electricity to ensure that cooling system functions, and you need a stable water supply to ensure that cooling system is still working. I think a lot of the microchips involved in data centers have, I think once they kind of hit about 87 degrees Celsius, I think that when they start to malfunction, and over 90, that's when they start to just completely stop working. But they're already operating at very high temperatures, which is why they need the cooling system. So building a data center in a colder environment does make sense, but obviously only if there is enough water and energy to be able to maintain it, because again, it needs to be operating 24/7. They can't really afford any time out. So it wouldn't surprise me if there were particularly like small scale hydropower dams being built to support it. We've seen that in Thailand, not with dams, but with very small power generators, and but we've also, while a lot of these seem to be renewable energy focused, kind of solar or wind generated, the majority of the data centers do seem to have some sort of like either diesel or fossil, some sort of fuel-based generator as well, just as a backup. But yeah, in terms of how much water it would need, really hard to say. Each data center is going to be different depending on the design and who's building it and where it is. But that, I mean, if it is Google or Meta, then there might be some mention of it in like a sustainability report. Certainly, I would say that Google were the most talkative out of all of the companies involved in developing data centers in Thailand. They were the only ones from the sort of global north that actually responded to our questions. So it's worth a try just asking them, I guess. I hope that's kind of helpful. Nicole, do you have anything there?
Not much. I just wanted to add actually that I always thought that Meta and Google were not as transparent as like the data center operators. And I think one thing that is also interesting and maybe helpful is that I think Google, Meta, Amazon, like all these big tech companies, they often also like to do this thing in which like they either build the data centers themselves or they outsource it to a data center operator. So maybe like having some clarity as to like, whether or not they are building it themselves or they're outsourcing it might be helpful. And then you can see like who are the operators that they are working with, and have a bit of insight as to like what kind of workloads as well. Because I think what kind of workloads the data centers are supporting can also determine how much electricity, power, water is being used. Because if it's like an AI data center, obviously like it's going to need a lot more. But if it's just like normal social media, emails, that sort of stuff, it's going to be a bit smaller. And I think you can then determine like what Nepal is or like Kathmandu is in terms of like how these giants are looking at the industry in the region. I think for like Singapore, Batam, and Johor, it was very much like I think they saw it as like like a hub for IT, finance, for like the big tech companies to have an anchor in Southeast Asia. Though of course, like I think different parts of Thailand have also emerged as that. But I think looking more into like what the data center is used for can be quite helpful. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gerry and Nicole. Saksi's question, which I shall ask. Like Nepal, the narrative around data centers in India is STEM adjacent things are good. For hyperscale companies, building data centers in India is a good thing, as it is putting us on the map as investment-friendly countries. Our union budget has freed any foreign company from paying any tax to the state till 2047. As Gerry mentioned, the conversation here is losing itself in debating if the amount of resources they are utilizing is not that significant. But places like Mumbai metropolitan region has plans to have more than 40 data centers. The city is facing water and electricity cuts amidst a drier monsoon. My question is this: how does one even tackle this ideology of believing that technological growth will indicate development in a country when mainstream media is pushing this narrative? Who wants to go first?
Oof, yeah, okay. Good question. Damn. Yeah, I mean, I've got to agree with what Nicole said earlier in terms of I'm not especially hopeful of journalism's power to kind of move the needle on this one. There's just so much money at play. And yeah, I think certainly for the time being, people are probably going to be quite receptive to the narrative of, technological development being good, especially when they see the volume of investment coming in. But I think probably one key thing to remember here is that this is still quite a nascent development in, data centers themselves are not necessarily new, but they are the scale of them and the rapid spread of them is really quite linked to the AI boom. And so I think as we're starting to see in parts of the US and parts of Europe where governments are cutting the benefits because they're starting to realize that, this unchecked growth and having granted tax holidays and various foreign investor benefits to these data center companies has naturally not improved the quality of life of any of their citizens. So, I mean, in terms of tackling it, I mean, I think that we can only really do what journalists do best, and that is just continue to find the facts and give voice to the people who are going to be affected as more of these data centers come online, and try to expose any dodgy dealings that might be helping these companies get those contracts. So I mean, it's a bit of a long shot, but I think it's probably the best we've got, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's tricky, right? I think Singapore is very similar to India in that it's like the narrative around building data centers is like, oh, yeah, it's putting us on the map as like an investment destination, which is going to trickle down into the economy. And I think there's a lot of fear, excitement around the population as well to like not be left behind. We want to be seen as like like an AI competent state, like our citizens can use AI and stuff like that. It's difficult. I think even for me as a journalist using AI and like grappling with this technology, I think I also feel a lot of ethical struggles in how much I believe that this technology is good. But I really try to, I don't know, I'm more on the side of like not for such rapid developments. And I do think that I try to take that in my day-to-day actions, people I speak with, the reporting that I do. Yeah, it's a bit bleak. I'm sorry. That's just, it's a bit hard. Yeah.
Thank you, Gerry, and thank you, Nicole, for your very thoughtful answers. It is difficult because this is not, like, systemic issues are not meant to be dealt with individually, right? The carbon footprint was pushed onto us by British Petroleum. A lot of this propaganda about how it's the individual consumer's responsibility, whereas the CEO is taking in millions and billions of paycheck, but we're meant to shoulder the burden of that responsibility, I think is the first step, just going easy on yourself. I know I'm not supposed to be answering this. I'm leaving it to the experts, but it is definitely something that irks me when we talk about the economy and GDP. A high GDP doesn't mean low inequity. So we want to disentangle wealth inequity and wealth in general, I think is the first step, because usually these things like tax cuts, are they good? When we say we're good for the country, who is the country? Is it the country's poor? Is it the country's rich? Is it the country's middle class? Usually we mean the country's rich. Elena has one more question, and if there's no one else, then I think we can end it there.
Sorry to prolong this conversation, but it's such an interesting one. Thank you both, Nicole and Gerry. I've actually benefited from your reporting in my own research on data centers. And one of the challenges I've had in trying to understand the data center landscape in Malaysia as well as in Southeast Asia is just the lack of granular level data, whether in country or in the region. And it sounds throughout your remarks that this has been the case with you. I just wanted to seek confirmation if this has indeed been the case in your work in your respective countries and throughout the region. But also, relatedly, a very short second question. I wonder if the lack of pushback that we've seen in our part of the world compared to, say, the United States, and I think a large part of it has to do with the optimism that, Nicole, you talked about, this bullishness about anything tech-related. But I wonder if the difference is also attributable to the fact that in the US, the initial data center build-out was done primarily in urban areas, and it's now creeping out to the rural areas. And so because of the location of data centers in mostly urban areas in the US, it's caused a lot of consternation, concerns. And I know in Malaysia, that hasn't really been the case. Like a lot of the data center build out has been in industrial zones or former agriculture lands. And so I wonder if from your work and reporting, whether you found this to be the case. I understand every country is a little bit different in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Elena. Yeah, I think for the granular data is really true. I think one of the reasons, and if I can also just be really transparent, we did a data piece, right? And I think one of the reasons why we took a bit longer than the other publications that were involved in this project to publish is because like we went through so much data. We literally looked through like all the available sources online and like compared it against another. It was just a lot of like cleaning up and just like, yeah, it was a lot, just going through every available source just to make sure that the reporting was accurate. And I think there's also a lot of like these operators and government statements that come online that are very big figures around like how much data centers built is going to be, how much money is going to bring in. So that was very interesting to observe. I think they're very quick to sort of boast how big these figures are. But when you ask them for like, yeah, exactly right, the granular data, I don't think we've really gotten a response on that. I don't know. I think the part about Malaysia, I feel like I don't know if it's a case of I mean, at least for Singapore, the data center builds were very much urban, right? Because whole of Singapore is urban, right? So our data centers were very much in city centers, and yet for some reason, like you could literally have housing buildings next to a data center, and I am not confident to say that these individuals knew that they were living next to a data center. And I think for Singapore, in part, that's very much because of the way we are as a country. I think the government does certain things in a certain way that, you know, like the citizens, you just don't think about it. It's very organized. But in Malaysia, I think because of how quickly things came online and the regulations not keeping pace with data centers being built, yeah, I think you see the fallout of it a lot. But I don't know if it's a matter of, you know, it fell upon the heads and shoulders of people that didn't have as much financial economic power as people living in cities, and therefore like the noise was a bit more quiet. And like I mentioned, right, the case with the protest in Geylang Patah was just, I think there was a settlement that was reached, and then you didn't really hear about it afterwards. So yeah, I think there needed to be that collective community. I mean, it's not their responsibility to do that, but I think you see in the US and like a lot of parts of South America, when communities shout back, they do it together in like silos, right? So I think Malaysia lacks a bit of that desire, yeah, which we see in like other parts of the world.
Yeah, just to kind of quickly add on to that, I think the lack of granular data was a massive headache trying to do this story, because with the exception of one company, I think, where we'd found this press release from the water utility, no one else would tell us the amount of water that they would need, the amount of electricity needed. One solution we did find to that was going to the local waterworks authority, like the provincial level waterworks authorities, who were in charge of sort of the final step in the process of getting water to these data centers. And I think with them, I don't want to say not being as media savvy as their sort of central agency offices in Bangkok, they were a little bit more open with us and just kind of gave us some of the data, which I suspect they probably weren't supposed to. But that did get us a little bit more information, just to be able to compare and contrast the volume of water needed in data centers. But I mean, we even had, after we published, one company, a PR firm representing one company did reach out to me to sort of say, oh, we're not sure we agree with your characterization of the water consumption. And so when I then basically had to sort of explain to them that, well, if everyone in one part of the country is using water from the same sources, then it doesn't really matter if there's a sort of weird distinction between whether this is industrial water or tap water or something. It's all coming from the same source. So eventually there's a finite supply of that and it will run out. The guy didn't reply after that. So I don't know what happened there, but I think in terms of the location and how much that matters in terms of determining community pushback, I think in Thailand what we saw, because most data centers are being built in industrial estates, like existing industrial estates or industrial parks, where communities have already had big problems with the factories that have opened in these industrial estates, and especially over toxic wastewater dumping, particularly from like e-waste recycling companies. So I think it wouldn't be hard for me to see data centers being kind of the next subject of more community-led protests. But again, I think for the time being, with so many of the majority of the new data centers that are being built in Thailand are still under construction, or still just in the planning stages. So it's kind of it even made reporting on it kind of difficult, because it is a more of a hypothetical issue. It's something that could down the line create a lot of problems. Whether it actually will is we're going to have to wait and see. But I think once there is more understanding and more data centers online, then we're probably going to see a lot more community response, or at least I hope so anyway.
From YouTube at Krish00KK asks, AI workloads run 24/7 when the solar and wind dip. How much of this gap is going to be filled by massive diesel backup generators? We need better battery storage policies. And so Yan has helpfully replied, the backup generators are only used when the grid fails. The type of energy a data center uses depends on the energy mix that's transmitted by the grid. Of course, off-grid data centers are a different story, like Elon Musk's XAI data center in Memphis that's powered by gas turbines. In case anyone else wants to add on that.
Weren't those gas turbines the one that were found to be producing a whole load of very localized pollution in predominantly black neighborhoods? But I'm pretty sure that was the Memphis mess. Actually, and one of the other, I mean, the grid failing is a very real risk in Thailand, where there's so much competition for energy among factories in the area that most of the data centers are being built. Often what happens is when a lot of these petrochemical companies, when the power fails, to prevent the liquid plastic from jamming up inside their factory machinery, they have to do these like burn-offs, which basically melts all of the plastic and send it out into the air as smoke. So every time there is a power cut that overwhelms the generators in these places, you get massive localized pollution. And so there's a big concern among academics who've been looking at these, the lack of decent power grid in the Eastern Economic Corridor in Thailand, and how data centers could exacerbate this issue. So I think, yeah, the battery storage would be great, whether that technology is there and whether it could be retrofitted to existing data centers if it is, when that technology becomes more readily available. That's a different story, I think, but definitely one to watch.
Munira, oh, sorry, Nicole, do you have anything that you would like to add as well?
No, but I'm looking at Munira's question in the interest of time as well, and she mentions about what advice you can give us to mobilize. I actually found, like, when reporting on Johor specifically, that there were a couple of like citizen journalists or like people in like the AI space, like software developers who were running their own podcasts, running their own Instagram pages, and were they had quite a sizable following, and like were quite vocal in talking about like these protests that happened online. I tried to interview them, but they weren't available. But I do actually think that, and there are quite a few environmental journalists on the ground in Johor as well. So I think it's about, finding a way to gather everybody. I think the people are there. It's just about like doing the coordination that I'm not saying it might be tricky, but I think like somebody has to do it, and it's very doable. I don't think it's not impossible. And the government does respond to, Johor's government does respond to when citizens have backlash against like data centers. I know there was a period of time where the electricity tariffs were being passed on to consumers, and then there was a bit of backlash, and then the government later said, okay, like we're not going to do that anymore. It's going to be tiered. Anything else more will be passed on to the data centers itself. So like small things like this work for sure. I think it's just a matter of like taking the effort to coordinate and mobilize and come together.
I love that answer so much. Exactly. The people are already there. It's just finding them. If you can reach out to the journalist who wrote the story about the protest, they probably have the contact of the organizer. And that's it for, Dong Liu has a question. Do we have time? For those who want to leave, feel free. Gerry, Nicole, are we good for one more? This would be the last.
Sure, I could do one more.
Nicole, I know that it's a very different time over there for you.
I'm good. I'm good.
Okay. So Dong Liu asks, a cover story published by The Economist in June suggested that concerns about data centers' water consumption may have been overstated. In fact, their water use may be lower than that of golf courses in the United States. However, some experts point out that this comparison may involve a conceptual sleight of hand, that these figures refer to different types of water use and therefore are not directly comparable. Oh, sorry, this is, Gerry, you touched on this already, but could you please explain this issue and clarify whether the comparison is accurate?
Yeah, I can have a go. The US is going to be very different. I think this is going to be a case of country by country analysis that's probably needed. I'll start by saying that golf courses, the hell of golf courses, that golf has no sporting value. It uses a lot of water for no particularly good reason. But that's my personal thoughts on golf. As for the water usage, I think we're going to see data center operators try to find any way they can to try and push back against the heavy usage of water, of electricity, of land. And so I think that probably a conceptual sleight of hand is a good framing, a good phrase there, because I would imagine that the water consumption is going to be far more nuanced than that. Because it's going to come down to the type of water that they can use. You can't use industrial water, for example, in Thailand at least, for data centers, because the cooling systems are too delicate. And you know, in industrial water, you would have impurities that could build up over time and could eventually wreck the cooling system, render it inoperable, and then your whole data center's offline. So from what we understand, a lot of the data centers in Thailand are typically going for like drinking water, tap water, and then having to add in their own anti-scaling agents to make sure that again, you don't have a rust building up in there as well. So I think a lot of it is going to come down not only to sort of the type of water, but also if it is all sourced from one finite space. In Thailand, for the Eastern Economic Corridor, for example, there are, I think, like 3 large reservoirs, and that's where everyone is getting their water from: data centers, factories, farmers, and residential outlets. So at the end of the day, you still only have 3 reservoirs of water, and it's really a case of how are you going to distribute it, and how equitable is that distribution going to be. So yeah, I don't know. The US is going to have different problems, different ways of dealing with it, and different water governance regulations, I imagine. So I think that sort of, but to me, it seems a little bit like a greenwashing attempt to try and play down the impacts, when we've known for some time now the volume of water consumed by particularly AI data centers is significant. So yeah, I take that with a pinch of salt.
All right. Thank you, Gerry. Thank you, Nicole. And thank you, everyone, so much for attending and listening and sharing your questions and ideas and opinions. If you have 3 minutes, we would really, really, really appreciate it for you to fill in the feedback form so we can make these events better in the future. And just a side note for the 2 questions we did not get to answer in terms of development of data centers and neo tech colonialism. If you are interested at all, you can read a book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. So it talks about the forces of unequal development. It was written decades ago, but it is still highly relevant today. And it helps, I think, give a broader picture about how these different factors influence each other in underdeveloping countries that are not as well off. If there's nothing else, then we will reach out to you for with Gerry and Nicole's emails, as well as all the links that we've shared, and our feedback form, which I have pinned, and I'm going to wait here for 1 minute, awkwardly staring at you as you click it, and then we will leave. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a good day.